You know, there are just some meetings and some interactions that are so contentious that they end up with love. Let's talk about the NATO Summit, what came about of it, and what's coming up this week. Hello there, everybody. Welcome back, NatSec nerds, to the end of the week, a national defense and foreign policy news review and commentary podcast. It is I, your good friend, Morgan Huston, aka Whiskey Mo, the internet's least famous academic. I am a scholar of national defense policy, irregular warfare, air power. There's so much going on this week. But this week, instead of covering a couple of stories as we've done in the past, we're going to cover something a little bit bigger. We're going to talk about the NATO Summit that happened last week. This episode is going to come out on the 18th of July, 2026. So not this week that this comes out, but the week previous, there was the NATO Summit. What is the NATO Summit? It is an annual meeting of the heads of governments of the alliance nations and a few other invitees. Here, they're going to talk about capabilities, defense investment, support for Ukraine, large policy issues that impact the NATO alliance as well as the areas of responsibility. These are people like the Prime Minister of the UK, the President of the United States, the President of France, et cetera, et cetera. It started out pretty contentious in that President Trump of the United States was making a few of the old claims and some new ones as well. There was discussions about the U.S. needing to have Greenland again. If you go back to some of my previous episodes, we talk about that, and it's still weird that that's a thing that he's so focused on. He also made a few threats towards Spain. This is in regards to Spain and as well as Italy not allowing U.S. forces to utilize their bases there within Spain and Italy, and that that the U.S. was going to stop all trade with Spain, which I think is a really interesting claim considering that the United States government really doesn't have control over the industry, which would go against their love of capitalism. It would come more towards communism or even Sovietism, which is a little bit slightly different. But it was really contentious for the first part. This was only a couple of days, but it was very direct and very much in line with the attitudes that President Trump and his administration has portrayed towards our European and our other North American allies, in that they don't spend enough, they're freeloaders. And then it also was very contentious in that President Trump was not happy that the alliance didn't come directly to the aid of the U.S. when it began its war in Iran. However, on that note, there was a possible door open for NATO involvement in Iran. Just some vague pleasantries and words given to about how NATO needs to support the importance of the Strait of Hormuz being open, the free exchange of commerce and freedom of the seas. And it was one of those things that a lot of observers couldn't figure out how NATO could technically get involved with the current war in Iran. NATO, by definition, is a defensive alliance, and we'll talk more about that later towards the end of this. But it would be really difficult. And I was listening to a podcast today as I was coming home from work, talking about the differences between President Trump's war in Iran right now and George Bush's war, the second war in Iraq, about how even then, at least, the U.S. went and got congressional authorization. They went and tried to make their case in front of the UN and then cultivated allies in the so-called coalition of the willing. While in this case, it was just kind of Israel and the U.S. decided to strike Iran, and there wasn't any coordination with allies and partners. And so I find this to be kind of interesting, and it's definitely a placating move on behalf of NATO and the EU, in that they know that the United States is an important ally, and they don't want to potentially end what is a very important alliance, and that has essentially kept the world from massive war for the last 80 years. But at the same time, it's vague enough that there's not necessarily a full-on commitment. So I'm finding this to be very interesting. I would really like to see what is going to happen next. The memorandum of understanding essentially has come to an end over the last week, with strikes going back and forth between the U.S., Iran, and Iran attacking our regional allies. So that'll be interesting. But I think that was a really important point, considering how much of the complaints against allied nations were about not allowing the U.S. to utilize their bases, and then the continuing revamping of this concern over U.S. control over Greenland. I don't understand that. I really don't. The U.S. has essentially had free reign to do as it wills security-wise on Greenland. I don't know why anyone would really want the U.S. to take over control. The democratic process has happened where the people of Greenland have continuously voted to continue to align themselves with Denmark, and it's weird. I can't figure it out, and I probably will never understand it. But continuing on, one of the next issues was around Ukraine, and Ukraine is very interesting in the fact that Ukraine is not a NATO member, but President Zelensky was there in attendance at the NATO Summit. One of the reasons and rationales for President Putin's war or special military operation within Ukraine was to root out Nazis in the government, but also because of the fear of Ukraine becoming a member of NATO. There's already a few NATO members who are bordering Russia. One has just recently come about with Finland joining the alliance. And within the NATO summit, what has come about in support for Ukraine is that the NATO nations, not including the U.S., have promised funds to Turkey. This is a 70 billion euro package, with some being loans from the EU and then also some defense support from NATO. This is really important because what this is showing is that the EU in and of itself is also becoming a more strategic defensive organization. It is the history of the EU is fascinating. It is generally considered what was started as an economic grouping of countries, which eventually has become a more almost federalist. It's not quite there yet, but like a federal organization and government above states of Europe. There's some within Europe that would love to see that become the case. Some are more leery of growing EU power. But what that does is, while it shows that the EU and NATO cover some of the same territory, they are operating separately. And money for Ukraine is really important. The United States has essentially stopped funding Ukraine and their support against the Russian forces, the Russian invasion, illegal invasion of Ukraine. And so NATO, these other NATO allies are really going to be important for the long-standing financial and military support that Ukraine needs to maintain its current pace. Ukraine itself is very much in a stronger position today than it has been in quite a while. They seem to be making very great strides in retaking some aspects of their territory back from the Russians, and this includes making very strong strikes into Crimea, attacking lines of communication, which are bridges and communications and wires and such like that, in Crimea and connecting back to Russia, as well as making deep drone and missile strikes into Russia itself, targeting fuel and munitions manufacturing facilities. So this is just continuing to show that there is a large outspring of support for Ukraine itself within Europe and the West. And while the U.S. may not be sending funds to Ukraine, there is a possible agreement for a Patriot license to Ukraine. What does that mean? The defense industrial base within the U.S. can license out the manufacture of certain weapon systems to countries. So they'll be based on American systems or American defense industries building of something, and then they can manufacture it locally. Europe itself is seeking this license as well to manufacture Patriot missiles within the continent, but Ukraine itself is a possibility. The president himself, President Trump, said that they are looking at granting the Patriot manufacturer license to Ukraine. Now, that will not be a quick and easy process. Like, there's spinning up of manufacturing, having to build up that capability. But that itself is fairly significant, because one of the things that has been a struggle both for Ukraine and in the U.S. in its current conflict with Iran is the dwindling stock of anti-aircraft and air defense munitions. If Ukraine was able to manufacture, and Europe itself manufacture, their own Patriot missiles, that would ease some of the burden on local American manufacturing when it comes to American air defense weaponry. And then a lot of that would be able to continue to feed the need for the current conflict with Iran, which at this point does not seem to be ending anytime soon. But also what we saw with this is also a softening of tone from President Trump towards President Zelensky. If you remember early on in the second Trump administration, there was a meeting with Zelensky where J.D. Vance berated him, and the president was not very gracious. This time it seems a little bit different. It seems a little bit more to acquiesce to each other. They seemed a lot more cordial in their tone. But these are some big policy wins for Ukraine in that, winning the support of President Trump right now, because the American administration is really much a cult of personality of President Trump. If someone runs afoul of President Trump, it's very easy for the machination and wheels of government to turn against them. So this is a very good thing, I think, for Ukraine, in that it kind of twists something. Like, the President Vladimir Putin called President Trump over the July 4th weekend, trying to maybe convince him in some sort of way to put pressure. And it seems like that has failed. And it seems like the conciliatory tone towards Ukraine is a much more victorious thing for Ukraine. In the same vein, when it comes to defense investment, the president also stated that he's looking at lifting sanctions from Turkey, which would allow the possible purchase of F-35s, which is a big deal. The F-35 has started to become a fairly common airframe utilized in NATO. The UK has some. Turkey would be one. I believe Italy is looking at it as well. And, it's always a good thing when allies can utilize much of the same equipment, because it allows for easier logistics in a time of conflict and war. And it's interesting because Turkey has been a very kind of problematic partner within the alliance, because I think they are Europe, but there's questions about how they fit into within the European perspective. Turkey's been a very important NATO ally for a long time. Nuclear weapons have been stored within Turkey. There's American forces there. One of the big NATO commands is in Turkey. And there's also concerns about treatment of people within the country, about the treatment of Kurdish rebels, and they have their own terrorist issues dealing with some extremist Kurdish forces. So it's been a very interesting thing, and I think this is interesting. A lot of people or a lot of countries are turning away from the U.S. in parts of the world. Within Africa, much of Northwest Africa has turned away from the West. Their long-term alliances or agreements with the U.S. and France have started to wane, and there's a much more turning to the east with Russia and China. So being able to reel Turkey back in could possibly be a really important thing. And I think it's interesting to see that sometimes the bluster and everything can have a positive impact. As I've always said, that I will definitely give kudos when necessary to the Trump administration, and I think this could possibly be a good thing. I think there's more to it. There wasn't a definitive answer. There's a lot of vagueness in a lot of these things between the U.S. and NATO and these bilateral agreements. I listened to an expert talk about how this is a very unique space, because these NATO summits, when President Trump is attending, they become less about the alliance in a whole and more of a stage for bilateral discussions and agreements, which I find interesting considering that, it should be something as a whole, but we don't know exactly how this is going to turn out, but it's going to be really interesting. But also one of the big things has been the increased defense spending across the alliance. There's been productive movement across all nations towards the 5% GDP that the alliance agreed to. There are some of the smaller nations have reached it. Estonia, Latvia have all reached 5% GDP spending on defense. We've talked about it before, but Germany has had to make changes to its constitution to change its spending allowance to allow for greater spending. And I think one of the things that this shows is that, there's been a long-standing commitment to decoupling themselves from American, and not in the sense that they don't believe in the alliance. It's just that there's concerns now about the American commitment to NATO, and that there needs to be a more inward look about how Europe defends itself. And it's no longer that these events are happening out of fear of what President Trump and his administration will do, but now it's seen as a public good that will come in a defense against the most likely risk to NATO, which is still Russia. And a lot of these things are going to be for the benefit of Europe as a whole, and that they're going to have to work together because there's no guarantee of the U.S. being there and always protecting them as previously thought. So what's interesting too is that a lot of this it also includes increased spending within the defense industrial base across the alliance, as well as a commitment to investments from Europe into the American defense industrial base, which has been something that I have really been praising the Trump administration for their attempts to move forward with a revitalized defense industrial base, a more diverse defense industrial base. I think that's a really good thing. Now, we'll see if the words turn into actions. I really hope this is the case, but we're seeing Canada and the European members have increased defense spending by over 20% in the last couple of years. There's now promises of new programs, joint programs, single programs, countries building up. And I find this to be really important. We've already talked previously in other episodes about the unique commitments between member nations in Europe, the nuclear discussions between the UK and France, the agreements with Germany to carry non-American nuclear weapons, because while Germany does not have its own nuclear weapon system, they do design some of their own weapons to be able to carry and support nuclear operations for NATO. And you see things like the Germans having forward deployed troops outside of Germany for the first time in a very long time, and the work with Estonia, Latvia, the Baltic nations to enhance their capabilities. So this is going to be a really good thing, I believe. Sometimes the bluster and everything can turn into something that's really great. And I think one of the most important things, now this is something that has garnered some really interesting discussion about, is this boilerplate conversation about, that's something that's always been said, because it is always in the end of the summit statement, or is it really important? One of the things that was talked about, and it was the very first thing, and the link for this NATO statement will be in the comments below, or in the description below, is a reaffirmation of the Article 5 commitment of NATO. For those of you who don't know, NATO's Article 5 states that an attack on one is an attack on all. It has only been utilized once, and that is after the attacks of September 11th, 2001, where NATO responded to support America's war in Afghanistan. It's the only time that Article 5 has ever been activated, and they've reaffirmed it. They said it was ironclad. The joint statement from NATO state that the Article 5 commitment was ironclad. And I think there are some people that see this as comforting in that America was part of this, because there's been vast concern about if the United States would uphold its Article 5 commitment and requirement to the alliance. And I hope that we do, because there's been so much blood shed by our allies in support of our wars and in our conflicts, that I think that it would be foolhardy and disingenuous for America to not uphold its Article 5 commitment. But that is the kind of overview of the NATO summit that happened last week in Turkey. It was really interesting. I'm going to share a bunch of links down below where there's some news coverage, some analysis, some documents that came out of NATO. One of the unique things that did come out of it is that there was not a commitment to a NATO summit next year. This has turned into an annual event. And I heard an expert say that it would actually be really good if NATO was to not do this and let some things kind of gather steam and roll. And I agree. I think it would be best if NATO was to not hold a summit next year and just kind of let the decisions go and just kind of roll with it. And so that's going to be really interesting. Now for some things that are coming up this week that I'm interested in. There's some other big events that are happening in the security space right now. The Aspen Security Forum just up the road from me here in Colorado. The Aspen Security Forum is held by the Aspen Institute, which is a fairly robust think tank that talks about foreign policy and national defense. The continued absence of most Pentagon officials is still continuing there. It used to be a regular attended event for senior military officers and defense officials. They would be presenting. They'd be active participants. But now with the Secretary of Defense last year having removed that, most of these think tank events are not going to happen, or not going to include American defense personnel. One exception is there is the Global Air and Space Chiefs Conference going on this week in London. It is a grouping of, for America's example, the Chief of Space Operations and the Air Force Chief of Staff are going to be there. They're going to be talking about space and AI and some of the interesting things that happen there. So I'm interested to see what that is. I don't know what next week's stories are going to be, but those may be two options. But they're things to look at. You can get the Aspen Security Forum. You can register and watch the live streams. So that's really interesting. But as always, if you found some value in this, please gently caress that like button. I really do appreciate anyone who takes the time to watch and to give me any of the support that's possible. I do think that this is valuable, and I would like to see more people see it. And if you would kindly please just click that subscribe button. It's free, helps me out. The more people that are subscribed, the more that this gets pushed out by the algorithm. And if you want to know when videos are released, you can go ahead and hit the notification bell. I really enjoyed trying to learn about the NATO summit. One of the things about being a fairly new national security and defense scholar is that there's a lot of things that had happened, and they weren't necessarily secret, but they weren't very broadcast to the general public, which is the whole reason I wanted to do this podcast, is because I think that, all politics are local, and even the impacts of national security and foreign policy will affect you at the local level. And I want the average citizen to know more. And as I learn more, I want to share it with you. But as always, thank you so much for taking the time to listen, and I'll see you again at the end of the week.